Have you ever just been relaxing in a puddle of your own vomit in some random cobblestone alley in the town you're in? And just when you think things can't get any better, you think this insane fever you have is starting to cause hallucinations because when you look up, you see a man-sized bird making its way to you. Don't worry, my friends, you're not hallucinating. What you're seeing is a plague doctor, and he's on his merry way to help you and save the day. Kind of. As I did my research on this topic, I came to the conclusion that plague doctors are the phrase happy accidents made into reality. Bob Ross would be proud. Plague doctors were weird in that they served a number of purposes. Predominantly, it is believed that they were there to treat the plague, but they were rarely successful in that endeavor. They were supposed to treat the plague, tally the dead, and be the last witnesses to those who were dying. Oftentimes, they would actually be called in as a witness to recite and verify the last words of the departed. Even though this was considered legitimate roughly 8 times out of 10, there were some plague doctors who used their position for some kind of monetary gain, such as stealing the wills and inheritances passed on by the newly departed or even charging extra fees to treat people. Anyways, these quote-unquote specialized doctors a majority of the time had in fact little to no medical training, which is why it wasn't uncommon for them to charge extra fees. Simply put, they needed the money. Some of them were legitimate doctors though, but not many. A plague doctor could have been anyone really. Your butcher, a policeman, your sketchy barber who's recently gotten into the meat pie selling business, your local drunk, or an up-and-coming young doctor trying to gain experience and make a name for themselves. So, before I talk about their costumes, which is easily the most iconic thing about plague doctors, let me talk about a couple big influential factors for their decision-making processes. For one, their costumes, and 2, how they went about administering treatments to people. Miasma theory. What is miasma theory, you may be asking yourself? Well, it's an obsolete medical theory that said diseases such as cholera, chlamydia, or even the Black Death were caused by a miasma, or a noxious form of bad air, also called night air. The theory held that the origin of epidemics was due to a miasma emanating from rotting organic matter. So, long story short, the plague was caused by bad/rotten air. The next thing is the medical theory of humorism. This theory says that the human body contains blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These are the things that determine how healthy you are and cause its pains, sicknesses, and ailments. Health is primarily that state in which these constituent substances are in the correct proportion to each other, both in strength and quantity, and as well as a good mix. Pain occurs when one of the substances presents either a deficiency or an excess or is separated in the body and not mixed with the others properly. I don't want to get too far down the rabbit hole with this one, but long story short is that your body's composed of 4 liquids, and when they're in balance, you're healthy. When they aren't, you're sick. So, with these things in mind, it makes it easier to attempt to understand their reasons for doing things. The costume. How exactly did this nightmare fuel of a costume actually come into existence? Well, before 1619, plague doctors wore whatever they thought worked. But once Charles de Lorme designed the Beaked Beauty, the use of this uniform spread all throughout Europe, with Paris being its point of origin. The garments of the costume consisted of a heavy waxed fabric, ankle-length overcoat, gloves, boots, a waxed leather hat, an outer overclothing garment, and a bird-like beaked mask with glass eyes, often filled with strong, usually pleasant-smelling substances. Some of these fragrant materials include juniper berries, lemon balm, mint, rose petals, lavender, myrrh. You kind of get the gist of it. They would also have a pretty sweet cane which was used to communicate with patients, examine them without actually touching them, beat some of the more desperate victims that tried getting too close, and because some people believe that the plague was a form of punishment delivered by God, some people would actually request the plague doctor whip them with it as a form of repentance. To top off this sleek aesthetic, oftentimes the suit would be covered in suet, which is just another way of saying fat, and this was to keep bodily fluids from sticking to their uniform. But this would have an important side effect, not known to these leather-clad birdmen, of keeping fleas from getting onto them. Does this mean that plague doctors were somehow immune from getting the plague? No, not at all. They would still contract it because of the sheer amount of exposure they had to it. But as mentioned before, they would use the wrong formulas but accidentally get the right answers, this inadvertent flea deterrent being one of them. Just to make this clear, Charles de Liorme is credited with the creation of the specific full-body suit that we are all familiar with today, but there are depictions and descriptions of plague doctors using bird-like masks from the 16th century. So the bird masks are older and Italian in origin, but the entire full-body suit that we know about is credited to de Liorme and French in origin. With the costume taken care of, let's discuss some of the methods of treatments that they practiced and administered. So, as I've mentioned a couple times already, these doctors were often inexperienced. Add that together with just the general lack of medical knowledge for the time period, and you end up with a creative list of different remedies, I guess you would call them, which they believed would stop the symptoms and cure the disease itself. Many different ideas were thought of, such as bloodletting the patient, which was when a doctor would place leeches onto major veins. Other ideas included cutting open bobos to supposedly remove the bad blood and pus from within them, and placing herbal ointments over the top of that. Placing frogs on the bobos, which was believed to help rebalance the patient's humors. Covering the bobos in human excrement, and even getting victims to breathe in the fumes from human excrement. Bet you didn't know that Jenkem was secretly the cure for the plague. Smaller ideas involved remedies such as wearing strong perfume, drinking hot drinks, carrying a lucky charm, smoking tobacco, or taking strong doses of laxatives. The most painful treatment, though not very common at all, but is still documented, was pouring mercury on the victim and placing them in an oven. Obviously, these treatments didn't work and often made matters worse and actually helped the process of increasingly upping the chances for the doctor to become infected with the plague as well. These brave warriors against epidemics were essentially contractors, and just like that title implies, before a plague doctor could grace a city with his totally useful services, an agreement must be struck between them and the city. A plague doctor contract was an agreement between a town's administrators and a doctor to treat bubonic plague patients. Fun fact, these contracts are still present in European city archives. A plague doctor was specifically hired by a European city or town to treat plague patients, rich or poor, in times of epidemics. This clause was mostly for the poor who couldn't afford proper medical treatment. Their contractual responsibilities were twofold: to treat plague patients and plague patients only. This was an attempt to prevent the spread of disease from plague victims to anyone else via a shared physician. With these contracts, you could barter with the city for anything you saw fit: your salary, housing, living expenses, citizenship to that city, when you would be paid, severance pay, and pretty much anything the plague doctor in the city felt was worth negotiating. For example, a plague doctor named Bernardino de Francesco Rinaldi obtained a clause in his contract when he was hired as plague doctor by the city of Volterra in 1527 that said essentially the city had the obligation to provide Bernardino with all and everything necessary for his life support: food, water, anything you can name, and for these living expenses to be paid through the city's expenditures. So, other than Charles de Liorme, I have a list of a few famous plague doctors. One in particular I found very interesting, and I'm sure you'll be able to figure out who it is. We have Giovanni de Ventura, who was well known in the Italian city of Pavia. We have Niall O'Glacan, who was well known to travel from Ireland, who then earned deep respect in Spain, France, and Italy for his work as a plague doctor. Ambroise Paré and Paracelsus, who were French anatomists who doubled as plague doctors, and Nostradamus, who recommended the removal of infected corpses, getting fresh air, drinking clean water, and drinking a juice preparation of rose hips. There's also a little blurb in a document called Traité de Fardement, where it shows in Part A, Chapter 8, that Nostradamus was also against bloodletting. It was pretty interesting to learn that the famous alleged seer and doomsday fortune teller Nostradamus was a plague doctor at one point in his life, and from the sounds of it, one of the more progressive ones. He's also a student of Bob Ross because, coincidentally, removing infected corpses from a city actually does help to reduce the spread of an epidemic. But Nostradamus only made the recommendation because, long story short, rotting bodies stink, things that stink equal miasma, so let's take this miasma out of the city. Happy accidents, as long as it works, that's all that matters. Another funny thing is that plague doctors were often subject to quarantine despite being public servants due to the nature of their work. So, in conclusion, plague doctors more often than not weren't actually doctors. They were contracted by the city and were obligated to help everyone, rich and poor. Their main purpose, which in my opinion served only as a placebo, was to treat plague victims, but also to tally the dead for logistical purposes and to document and stand as witnesses to the wills of the departed. It wasn't uncommon for them to charge extra fees for their services, and they sometimes got things right despite having the completely wrong train of thought, and they ended up designing a suit that would become a pretty cool Halloween costume in the future. I hope you all enjoyed this episode of the podcast. I'd actually been attempting to write this script for about 2 months, and different things kept popping up in my life, and then boom. What more motivation could I possibly ask for to finish this script on plague doctors than an actual global epidemic? Anyways, I hope everyone stays safe and healthy out there, and if you enjoyed this episode, please follow and share my podcast with your friends and family. You can listen to it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Anchor, and pretty much anywhere you can listen to a podcast. You can also get a hold of me at mythshistorydnd@gmail.com, which I'll link in the description below. Thank you again for listening, and I hope you tune in to the next episode.